Good evening. Welcome to tonight's On the Edge with me, Theo Chalmers. Tonight's show is in our brand new set, and once again it's 2 hours long and live. So if you have any questions for our guests during the show, text them to us. Text EDGE and then a space and your name, location and your message to 87778. And we'll try to pick up on any that really hit the mark. They're all charged at standard rates, so why not get texting? In tonight's show, I'll be talking with two very exciting guests on the subject of the year 2012 and what cataclysmic events might be in store for us and our planet in that long-awaited, fateful year. Live online by video link, we've got world-famous researcher, author, public speaker, and historian Michael Tsarion. And in the studio, I'm joined by a researcher who's been studying the mysteries of the year 2012 for over 25 years. And he's also the author of several books on the subject. He's Jeff Stray. What a show we've got tonight. Welcome to you both. Jeff, welcome. Michael, can you hear me?
Yes, indeed, Theo, I can hear you. Thanks. Nice to be on the show with you guys.
Welcome.
Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Michael.
Welcome. I think I'll start with you, Michael, just in case we get any technical problems and we lose you. You obviously work in lots of different areas of research, and I want to know really how you got involved in this. How did you become interested in all these areas that you write about, that you produce DVDs about, and in fact, also in 2012, if you could give me a bit of a history.
Prophecy has always been interesting, to me. I mean, there's many threads, of course, that lead one to any particular area of research, especially anything as esoteric and deep as these particular matters, and also, I would say, controversial. But specifically talking about 2012, I guess it was an extension of my work with astrology and the divination arts, the tarot, Kabbalah, and the numerology. This is one of the major threads that got me interested. And when you go into that, it's a tremendous study. I have an online mystery school. I have written extensively on, the Hermetic arts, the divination arts, with an emphasis on the fact that it's not so much about rocks floating in space. It's not so much about, the magic rays affecting consciousness and all of this kind of thing that, a lot of astrologers and a lot of people believe, because, of course, then you're tying into the whole idea of predestination and all of these kinds of things. My take on astrology is a little bit different. It's more based on the idea that it's about consciousness. In fact, in all my work, consciousness is never left at the door. It's always, the prime datum. And especially in astrology, the idea is that whatever is in the zodiac, whatever the zodiac is, and of course this then includes not just the Western idea of the zodiac, but any other cultures, whether you're talking Sumeria, or you're talking the Celtic, or you're talking, the Maya. Whenever you're talking about the zodiac, it's really an extension of what goes on in our own heads. In other words, to make it simple, we have an inner zodiac. This is, what my work emphasizes a lot. It's very much along the lines of what Carl Jung was talking about the archetypal nature, and that whatever is in consciousness is projected externally onto the outside world. So yes, I acknowledge that the material world affects consciousness, but I also insist that consciousness itself has the ability to mold and change matter. And that's what the zodiac basically is. It's a sort of a plastic template of whatever's in our consciousness, the 12 divisions of consciousness. And then you can subdivide those into the 3 and the 4. This is where the planets come in. And this template of consciousness is what ancient man, and is what we all do, we project it onto the night sky in a way that Jung clearly explained through the faculties of projection and inflation. And so we have the phenomenon known as the zodiac. So it's not about rocks floating in space with some sort of magic rays affecting consciousness in the way that most people would normally think, what the layman thinks. And what a lot of astrologers, misgivingly, perhaps they haven't done a lot of, homework, because it's really an extension of the psychology of human beings. And when you get into that, then you start to realize what these ancient shaman were talking about. They were very up on this. See, modern astrologers and the people who have their, bestsellers out there and their books on the spinner racks, they may call their work archetypal. They may use phrases like, spiritual, archetypal, hermetic, or psychological. And then they go on to show you that they really don't have much clue about what those words really mean. But you track back and start getting into the Druidism and into the Maya and into the ancients, and they absolutely understood that there's a tremendous connection between the microcosm and the macrocosm. And it was basically my interest in that started to open up the door about prophecy in general. Whether you're talking about the coming age of Aquarius or the ending of the old cycle of Pisces, tracking back to Akhenaten when it was the age of Aries, moving into Pisces. Then we have the Christian mythos, you see, arising in Pisces. Then there's the supposition that we're moving into another age, whether you look at it from that point of view, or whether you're looking at it from the point of view of what the Maya said, where there is a potential age of awakening, which is then very much corroborates what I believe is in the book of Revelation and so on, which is, again, a book of prophecy within the Bible. There's lots of prophecy, astrology, and sidereal mythology within the Bible. So this is basically, to answer your question, what started me. It was looking at the astrotheological aspects. It was looking at the prophetic aspects of the Bible and the ancient scriptures.
Now, talking about the Maya, I noticed some of the things I've seen that you've written, you believe that this change, whatever is going to happen in 2012, has already started. Could you elucidate on that a little?
Well, and even in the Maya prophecy, they don't talk about it happening overnight. They're talking about a series of changes, a series of ages that open and close, certainly. Certainly within astrology, that's a given, because you have, of course, the famous 12 houses. And in the Egyptian system, they talked about even 36 houses. And, there's other miscellaneous systems out there, but the idea that there are these houses that open, the planets and the sun and the luminary move to their peak, and then these cycles close again, is very, very important. It's important to realize that there are these mini cycles and these certain milestones. We've just passed a very important milestone within the last 30 days regarding the planet Pluto. Back in 2007, there was an important, archetypal milestone around the year 2007. So we have the mini ones, and then we've got the larger ones. The Maya prophetics are talking about the 13-year, cycles. But in every discipline, whether you're talking the Vedic system, or whether you're talking some sort of a Druidic system, or whether you're talking the Vedic system of India or the Western systems of England, yes, that's what you have. You have ages, you have aeons. Again, picked up in the Bible, an esoteric reading of the Bible, you hear mention of the aeon. And the Christ talking about that I will come again at the end of the age, And this also is astrological. This can be interpreted astrologically. So it's very, very important for people to be aware of these cycles, because what happens on the calendar, as I said, and what happens in the zodiac is really, a projection of what's happening in consciousness. So this is how personal it gets. It affects societies, but it affects individuals as well.
So
the zodiac is the celestial timepiece, and it's not just some arbitrary thing out there. It's actually much more important than the watch that you have on your hand and the clock we have on our walls. And the reason why those clocks, even today, traditionally have 12 divisions, is based again on the zodiac having the 12 divisions. It's very, very important information.
So if something is happening already, are there signs that we could see, that we can talk about?
If you have the pattern recognition to notice it, because the very word sign comes from the old word sin, which meant the moon. So even when you talk about, hey, I've just had a sign, and the way that they would even use the word omen. If you go back and track back into what appears to be the folk legends and the fairy folk tales, and even the etymology, the words that we use, you're dealing with the moon, you're dealing with the luminaries, you're dealing with the sun, and my goodness, look at religion. A lot of my work emphasizes the solar aspects and also the Saturnian aspects and the stellar aspects of religion. So absolutely, if you have the pattern recognition, then just like Joseph Campbell said, this mythos is happening perpetually. It doesn't stop. It doesn't take a day off. There's no holiday, there's no vacation, there's no break. It's happening perpetually. But we have the mind-forged manacles, you know, that William Blake spoke of. We are the ones who have the blinkers on. We're just, you know, infatuated with our own sense perceptions and our narcissistic stuff. So obviously, you know, it goes unseen, but it's there morning, noon, and night. Absolutely, that mythos, that magic, is there for those who, you know, study, for those who get into this esoteric information, and for those who have the passion to see these intimations. Absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Jeff in a moment, but before I do, I've got a question for you that has been texted in from Paul in Warrington, and he says, wasn't the Bible based on astrology itself based on the Egyptians' beliefs?
Yes, it was. Paul is absolutely up to speed there, because, of course, it's not that you just have one interpretation of any scripture, but yes, the Bible, and remember that goes for the Apocrypha, that goes for other scriptures, including the Quran, that goes for the Torah, the Old Testament, and it goes for the Gnostic Gospels, it goes for the Essene Gospels, it goes for any, you know, as I said, the book of Revelation, which is, again, tremendous study of what that really means from an astrological and spiritual point of view. So these documents are alive with this. They're not to be read on just one dimension. They can be, but there's so much more esoteric information there. And one of the best ways to decode the ancient scriptures, as it is to decode even the sort of emblems and logos and symbols that we see in the corporate world today, in the social world today, is astrology. It is the sidereal mythology. That's a big code breaker in these areas. It's one of the areas that, again, was one of the threads that led me to want to look deeper into this whole question of the ancients and their prophecies.
Okay, well, that's really interesting. Let me just move over to Jeff for a moment and get him in the room. As you know, I hope, Jeff has written several books, and he's been researching 2012 since 1982.
Yeah.
Is that right? I'm going to show the camera a couple of your books. This is 2012 in Your Pocket, which I read this afternoon, actually, and it's a fascinating book, and it is incredible how many different societies all over the world, going back thousands of years, have got 2012 as a special end-of-time date. So here's another one. There's the full version. Beyond 2012 is Catastrophe or Ecstasy. So, Jeff, what have you discovered?
That's a big question. Well, where should I begin?
Perhaps with the history of all these peoples that have, you know, like the Maya and all the other cultures that have said 2012 is a special date, end of time.
Most people connect this with the Maya, but the Mayanists, those are the people, the academics that study the Maya, have only recently started to get interested in this themselves. They didn't like to get involved in the whole discussion before, because it brings in a lot of end of the world sort of discussion. So
and they're a bit touchy about that, aren't
yeah, I mean, a couple of years ago, they were saying, generally, they were saying, well, anthropologists and Mayanists were saying that the Maya had nothing to say about 2012, and that the whole thing was hype, or that had been brought forward and hyped up by New Age people. But in fact, it turned out in April 2006 that there is an inscription that mentions 2012, and it's from the classic era.
This is in addition to all the calendars that they produced with different...
Well, yes, I mean, regarding the calendars, the calendar that concerns 2012 is called the Long Count calendar, and there's a cycle called the 13 Bacton cycle. A Bacton is a cycle of around 400 years. 13 of these Bactons makes up one of these large cycles, and the 13 Bacton cycle started in 3114 BC, way before the Maya actually started making this calendar system, they backdated the start date, as we do with our calendar in the birth of Christ. But the Thermodynamic Maximum cycle terminates on winter solstice 2012, which is the 21st of December. So, of course, over the years, once this started coming out, people start to wonder what this means, the end of a calendar in 2012. What does this mean? And when you look at Mayan mythology and Aztec mythology in particular, which has survived a little better because the Spanish left only 4 codices, that's the bark books of the Maya. There's a few more of the Aztec ones that we can look at. When you look at that, it turns out that they both record past eras, and the eras that sort of ended in a destruction, and then there's a new era. But the Maya call that a creation point, rather than focusing on destruction. And there is a trajectory of an evolutionary trajectory that goes through it, where after each renewal, the next creation, the next mankind, is like one step up the ladder. That's the general. So
it's about evolution.
Yes.
And what was this inscription that you were beginning to talk about?
The inscription is at a place called Tortuguero, which is in Chiapas in Mexico.
I found the mention of that in here, didn't I? But anyway, better if you say it.
Yes. And as I say, that up until a couple of years ago, the Mayanists were saying that there isn't one, because basically only a small pocket of them knew about it, and it wasn't something that was greatly discussed, unless you knew which particular museum to go and look in, or you happened to have read a few of the small papers that mention it, because it's not a very big site. It's quite a small archaeological site, but it says at the end of the 13th Bacton on 4 Ahau 3 Kankin, that's 3 calendars, cross-referencing one date, which is 21st December 2012. It will be the return of the 9 support gods, which is literally Bolon Yokti Ku, which means the 9-footed god, or the god of 9 steps. This god or gods, it's a god that is seen as 9 individuals or a collective one god, will return to the, and then you can't finish it because there's damage to the monument, unfortunately.
So we don't know what is going to happen.
No.
We know something's going to happen. But it wasn't just the Maya, was it? There were lots of other cultures. Do you want to talk a bit about the Hopi Indians and all the other cultures?
Well, the Hopi is an interesting one. They haven't really specifically mentioned 2012, but they've got a series of 9 prophecies, 8 of which have been fulfilled. The last one of which I think was about the coming of the hippies. It mentions people with long hair that are interested in the ways of the indigenous people of North America. But previous ones were talking about railway lines coming and longhorn cattle and that sort of thing. There's a series of 9, 8 of them have been fulfilled, and it leaves only one, which it's about the coming of what they call the Blue Star. And it says, when the Blue Star Kachina dances in the plaza and takes off his mask, that will be the end of the Hopi ceremonies, and then it will be the beginning of the end of the purification period and the beginning of what they call the 5th world, because the Hopis say that we're currently in the 4th world, and before that was the 3rd world. It's similar to what the Maya and the Aztecs say. There's a series of these past eras. And
it would be a different sort of consciousness, would it, in this 5th world?
Yeah, they say that there's this transition point between these eras. They call it an emergence, and that it's compared to a human birth. And they actually have a ceremony every year in an underground chamber called a kiva, where there's a hole in the floor called a sipapu, which represents the ascent from the previous era, which is underneath, the previous world.
The different kind of consciousness.
Yeah, and the current world is represented by the kiva, world being this world era, the 4th world, and then the stepladder is sort of an umbilicus that leads to the outside of the kiva, the outside world, and that represents the emergence into the next world, the 5th world. And they represent that emergence with the symbol that the Greeks used, the labyrinth symbol.
Oh, right, the Minotaur.
Yes, yes, the labyrinth of the Minotaur, yes.
Okay. So let me just go back to Michael for a second. Michael, this kind of change in consciousness idea that Jeff has introduced here, does that have any resonance with the studies that you've made? Oh, Michael, I think we've lost you. I can see you. I can't hear you. I'm going to go back to Jeff.
Right.
Until we get Michael back.
Okay, well, continuing on about the Hopi then, every year they have a ceremony in this kiva.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, right, okay.
Michael, you're back.
Yeah.
Well done.
Okay, There was a setting that had gone crazy, but yeah, I can hear you now.
So, yeah, we were just talking about this possibility that what happens in 2012 is not, you know, maybe the destruction of mankind, but is some major evolutionary change where we become something different. I mean, do you resonate with that as an idea?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. This is, in fact, the bottom line. Otherwise, this would just be a mere, you know, so unimportant, you know, to be tracking this kind of technology. Basically, it's the psychological elements of how this affects human beings, how it affects them on an individual level, and how it also affects them, you know, socially. And as I said in the introduction to your first question, absolutely, in all the shamanic teachings and all of these ancient hermetic traditions, you have this concept, not just of an individual, just as Greg was saying about that individual going through his underworld experience and then, you know, emerging at a higher state of consciousness, but you have that also happening to mass groups. You have this concept of change socially and also politically, very much seen at the cusps of these transitions when one age or one cycle ends, you see, as we're in now, and then there's the potential of it opening into something new. Whether you're mapping that from the 12 houses of the zodiac or through the Maya system is really immaterial. You know, it's like I always describe it as, look, imagine tea leaf reading. You know, when you go and have a tea leaf reading, whether you believe it or not, at least you don't ask what kind of tea the reader's using.
Okay.
You know, that's immaterial, isn't it? If it's Taifu or PG tips. No, it's the point is there something coming out of that reading? So these miscellaneous systems, one also has to realize that the miscellaneous divination systems, that is a secondary, you know, interest. It's a great study and so on, but for me, what is most important is not the tea leaves, it's the prophecy, it's the wisdom, it's the, you know, the spiritual teachings that come out of those particular disciplines. It doesn't matter really what your crystal ball is made of. And it's the same thing with the zodiac and all these various miscellaneous systems, because I know that somebody in your chat room or somebody listening to this is going to be asking that question, hey, why are there so many miscellaneous systems, the Vedic, the Western, the tropical, the Maya, etc. Again, the bottom line is that there are these important sea changes within the individual. In fact, what Rick was saying there is very important, because remember in the beginning I was talking about how this does relate to psychology. I mean, he will know that they also have the perennial story, not just of the umbilical cord, you know, that leads you from one realm to another, but there's also in the Maya and Aztec the story of the tree of life, the galactic tree of Shibala, you know, that is also a sort of a gateway or a portal from one dimension to another. Isn't it? People who are up on, you know, the work of Carl Jung, don't they know that the idea of coming from the kiva, from down below, from the great darkness of the grotto into the, you know, the sunlit realm, is based on man moving out of his unconscious realm into the conscious, you see? So again, everything has its parallel within consciousness. Everything has its parallel there. And these changes are, all that these astrological modalities are doing is they're mapping those changes within the psyche of man and society.
Well, you mentioned divination there, and I know that one of Jeff's examples of the 2012 thing in this book is the I Ching, which is a divination system, right. Ancient Chinese. How does that link to 2012, Jeff?
This was, you know, and his brother, when him and his brother Dennis went down to the Amazon rainforest in the early 70s. They had, well, they were looking for a hallucinogenic snuff at the time, which they'd heard the people that take the snuff.
Ayahuasca, was it?
Well, that was what they ended up taking, the ayahuasca vine, but they principally were looking for, I think it's called UP, a sort of a hallucinogenic snuff which they never found, which they heard that this blue substance comes out of, not at the moment, blue substance comes out of your pores if you're a shaman using this, and then they mould it to do their magic. Okay. And then people that have taken this can also see it. But they ended up having a combination of the ayahuasca vine and a psilocybin mushroom, and they had a 34-day hallucinogenic experience in which they communicated with alien insectoid anthropologists from the future.
Okay. I can see a few texts will be coming in about that one, yes.
Well, they were informed, particularly Terence was one of the brothers that took this one on. He was informed that the whole of what happens in space-time is actually encoded into this ancient Chinese oracle, the I Ching, which is 64 hexagrams, which are hexagrams are lines which are either yin or yang, and it's basically a collection of every way you can combine those. And by a complex procedure, he converted all that into a set of numbers. The numbers were converted into a graph. The graph was fractalized so that the same graph is encapsulated within itself, and the result would show all the change in the universe from the beginning of time to the end of time at lots of different levels, right down to the time it takes an electron to go around the nucleus of an atom. So once he got the graph, he then had to correlate it to history to find out where we were on the graph. He used the explosion of a bomb at Hiroshima in 1945 as correlating to a big peak on the graph, which is called a dip into novelty. And then exactly 384 years later, the graph hits the baseline.
I'm sorry to break in there, but we're going for a break. If you'd like to text in your questions or comments for Michael Tsarion or Jeff Stray, do so now. Text the word EDGE, then a space, and then your message to 87778. See you very soon. Thank you. Welcome back to On the Edge with me, Theo Chalmers, and my special guest tonight, Michael Tsarion, who's on the line, and I've got in the studio Jeff Stray, and we were just talking about the I Ching and how it relates to 2012. So if we can just get back to that for a second, Jeff.
Yeah, so once he got the this fractalized wave, and the novelty hits the baseline at the end of the wave, and then he'd correlated the big peak on the wave to the explosion of the Hiroshima bomb, which was...
They were looking for a place to start it, were they?
Well, to correlate into history, because they got the wave which starts at the beginning of time and goes all through right up to today, but they knew we were just somewhere in the last bit, so they had to find a massive event that they could correlate to, with a novelty event, something that had not happened before, to correlate to a big spike on the graph.
And they weren't trying to link it to the Mayan calendar, I take it?
No, they didn't know anything about the Mayan calendar at the time the first book came out.
So they wanted this novel event, and they decided that Hiroshima...
Yeah, so they
which, of course,
they
was
date Hiroshima,
novel, I suppose, wasn't it?
Yeah, presumably a major explosion of a nuclear device hadn't happened over a populated city on Earth before. I mean, some people might argue that, I don't know. But that was their presumption. And then, so once they correlated that to this major spike, then it was only 384-day lunar years after that that the graph hits the baseline, and that's called, because unlike a normal graph, this goes down rather than up. So when it hits the baseline, maximum novelty happens.
And that happened to be?
That happened to be the 17th of November 2012.
Which is pretty close to what the Mayans are saying, which is 21st of December 2012.
Yes, 34 days difference. And I was studying that for several years before I knew also about the Maya calendar. And then that's what really sparked me off on this, that there's a system from a solar-based system from one side of the world, which is a Maya system, which is over 2,500 years old, and then the lunar system of the early I Ching, which is over 4,000 years old, and they both terminate within 34 days of each other.
That's extraordinary, isn't it? Michael, I've got a text in here which I think is one that you might want to take. It says, "It's started already. Just look at the babies who have been born lately and how advanced their brains are." And that's from Richard of London. And I know you've been working with these indigo children. Can you describe that a bit?
Yes, it certainly has been happening. It's going to be happening even more. My work with the young was to help develop these pattern recognition skills. Not so much to pedantically try to, instill something in them, but more to bring something out of them that's already there, been buried under all the BS, And what's going to happen now, remember I said that there's a pretty big milestone event just happened in the last 30 days regarding the planet Pluto. Specifically speaking, Pluto has moved into the sign of Capricorn and is going to stay there for about 13 years. And of course, if you divide 13 by, into triads, you're up to about 4 years. And that the first 4-year segment of this transit of the planet Pluto will take us up to 2012. So this is an important sort of, again, as we said, there's certain mini cycles, there's certain larger cycles. This is a very key cycle that's going to sort of midwife us down. And one of the effects of that is going to help any outsider. I look at children as basically outsiders from a spiritual point of view. This movement of the planet Pluto is going to assist in people shrugging off, the mind-forward manacles. It's going to help with the spirit of rebellion a lot. And you're going to see this in children. So Richard is absolutely right. You're going to see it in children, and you're going to see it in the childlike. You're going to see it in people who haven't lost their innocence, who haven't lost their spontaneity, who haven't lost their, zest for life, and got totally tied into the whole matrix of control that the other side, is so interested in having. And also they have their own agenda, working towards the global village and all of these kinds of things. And where are we going to find the counterbalancing force for all of that tyranny? Well, that's the miracle. That can be found in the young, and it can be found in the young of heart. So there's lots of things going to be happening in the next 4 years as we spiral down to 2012.
Can we talk a bit more about Pluto? Because one of the things I think I've read that you've written, and I'm a bit confused on this, is that Pluto, or perhaps our solar system, is going to cross some kind of ecliptic. If you regard our galaxy as, say, a plate, it's going to go from beneath the plate to above the plate. Is that correct? Something like that? Or is it just Pluto? Or
no, Pluto has had a conjunction with the galactic center. And then, of course, we have the Sun, is meant to be in alignment with galactic center in 2012. Other than that, I'm not sure. I've just been tracking it as it moves through the different signs of the zodiac. As I said, this is a big study, so there's lots of different, trigonometry involved in this, lots of different astronomy involved in this. I always approach it from an archetypal point of view that Pluto is very connected to Shiva in the Hindu Trinity, once you get into the symbolism of it. And since Shiva was the third part of the Hindu Trinity, or the Vedic Trinity, or the Aryan Trinity of the East, that equivalates to the Western Trinity aspect is the Holy Spirit. So what we're seeing now, if you want to use Christian parlance, is that you're seeing the movement of what has been described as the Holy Spirit. Maybe not as a Christian would understand it, granted, but nevertheless, symbolically speaking, from a Gnostic point of view, from an esoteric point of view, we have the Spirit, what I would call the Holy Spirit moving, acting at this particular age. And some people are going to have to get with that, because that is also going to be quite challenging for people who are, as I said, lost in the lie, not able to make the changes, not able to get with the new paradigm that is being demanded of us by that higher intelligence.
I've got another question here. How does sacred geometry link in with the astrological systems you're talking about? This is from Gary from Hull.
Well, briefly, it's a huge subject there. You're talking about yourself. How my work focuses on sacred geometry is how the elites, how the various oligarchs and aristocrats have aligned their own buildings, their own temples, their own lodges, their own cities, if it comes to that, with constellations and with important events, luminaries, because we've been talking here about astrology, we've been talking about events that happen up in the sky. We have to also understand that just like in the ancient days when the Druids built the stone circles and the Maya constructed their great pyramids and all of this, well, you see, that kind of thing has not gone away. Today what is happening is sacred geometry is still being used. I wouldn't necessarily call it totally a malign reasoning, but let's just face the fact that the Knights Templars and the aristocrats of the world have made great use of this. There's documented evidence of this, that they have used the patterns of the heavens, right? Even to the laying out of Washington, D.C. and of Paris and so on. There's something going on here with the sacred geometry, with the understanding, not just of, like what I said earlier about the psychic and the physical having a connection, but the terrestrial, right? And the sidereal having a connection. So the ancients know this. This is where they built their clock towers with the clocks so high up you can't read the time. But what's that symbolically mean? Is time from heaven coming to earth? The design of certain plazas and certain squares over cities, the friezes that we find on a lot of civic buildings. You see, there's a whole astrological symbolism being used here to bring the so-called sidereal reality to earth, to the terrestrial, and it's rooted in this whole idea of the connection that is understood by the elites of the world, that there is a connection between the psychic and the physical.
Well, talking of the elites of the world, and There's a question here from John. I think this is Northern Ireland, one of your, perhaps from where you're from, Michael. He says, how aware are the hierarchy of the things the guests are discussing?
I would say, of course, super aware. Was it Josh you said his name was?
No, John. John in Northern Ireland.
John needs to take a walk, you know, around even Belfast with educated eyes. Take a look at the, you know, go to the Masonic lodges there, take a look at the steps, the design, take a look at the city streets design, go out to the various ancient megaliths and do some measurements, and you'll find that megalithic yard is still being used. The megalithic measurements are still being used to align certain buildings, churches, cathedrals, temples, lodges, etc. So, you know, don't believe what I say. You know, take your dog for a walk one day and take your, you know, thinking cap along with you, and just check out the amazing, you know, designs in the churches and cathedrals, and get into this whole idea of the placement of a lot of these buildings. I've gone onto this in the Irish Origins DVD about the placement of certain churches near certain sacred sites of the ancient world. They know a lot about it. That's a whole study in itself. It's fascinating.
Okay, here's a really good question, and I'll put this to Jeff. It says, do Michael and Jeff see indications in the ancients' forecasts that we will have more close encounters from off-planet sources? I'm not sure who that's from because it gets cut off at the end there, because the long texts, you send in a long text, we don't see the end of it, so keep them short, please. So, Jeff, what do you think?
Well, I mentioned the Tortuguero prophecy earlier. That said it's a prophecy of the return of the 9 gods. Whether those gods are from beyond or not is can be discussed. I mean, the god of the 9 steps, also called 9-dog tree, or there's various other translations of that. They don't actually know that much about this little group of gods, but they know a bit more about another group of 9 gods who were called the Bolontiku rather than Bolonyoktiku. And those were the 9 gods of the underworld. So it's a bit confusing when you actually look into who these 9 gods were. It's very interesting, the 9 gods of the underworld, because they actually include one of the major gods in one of the versions of who these include. It includes Zamna, who is one of the major gods you would expect to be in the 13 heaven gods, but he was actually in the 9 underworld gods.
Well, Jim from Perth is asking, what is your take on the planet Nibiru? Is it for real? Does it pose a threat? Is that alien visitation? Is there a giant planet in a big elliptical orbit about to approach Earth?
All the information I've looked on this seems to originate from Zechariah Sitchin, and his interpretation of a certain cylinder seal is where most of it comes from. As far, I mean, Michael may have his own version of this, but there's another guy who's studied. There's not very many people who can read cuneiform scripts. There's another guy, O'Brien is his name.
I've seen that website that criticises Sitchin.
Oh yes, sitchiniswrong.com.
Yes, I have seen that. Well, Michael, what's your take on that? What about Nibiru? Are we in for a big elliptical orbit planet coming back and causing havoc?
It's not something I buy into. The reasons are many and varied. The reason would be the same as most of my critiques of Sitchin, and I'm not saying that I'm totally against everything he's saying. He's done some amazing work, but one of the overarching criticisms that I have with his work, and it goes with the question, it answers the question, is that, you see, his work is not as corroborated by other traditions and mythos. So he may be genuinely reading and studying what is in the Sumerian record. So let's give him that. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt of that. But I think that what we would ask for is a little bit more corroboration when you cross-reference these findings with the, the teachings of others. You see, don't forget that also Immanuel Velikovsky is a person that Zechariah Sitchin, whether he admits it or not, is very much a prodigy of, certainly from a subject matter point of view. And so that's just one name I can mention, you know, in brevity. And Velikovsky does not mention this. Allen and Dallaire, in their book When the Earth Nearly Died, talk about many of the same things that were found in the old Sumerian scripts, and they don't mention anything about a planet on another orbit. You know, that always reminds me of the old Doctor Who Cyberman planet, you know, of Mondas. So, yeah, as a fictional idea, I think it's wonderful, very dramatic. You don't expect the TARDIS to appear any minute, but, you know, as a reality, I don't know. It's not corroborated enough.
Well, there's this book by Christian and Joy O'Brien called Genius of the Few. He's, as well as the Sitchin is Wrong Man, he is also one of the few people who can read cuneiform script. And he studied the same sources as Sitchin. And he came to a lot of the same conclusions, that our ancestors were crossbred from the anthropoid species on the planet at the time, crossbred with another group, an advanced humanoid group, who he doesn't actually conclude came from another planet or from Nibiru, but just that they were an advanced species that had flying machines and could do genetic engineering. So that much he corroborated Sitchin, but not the Nibiru part.
So it could be that they come from lots of other places, including another dimension, or...
It could be, or they might have just been
or...
an advanced race that were already living on this planet, even.
Okay, here's another question. The pyramids of Giza align exactly to Orion's belt, previously unknown to modern-day astronomers. How did they know? And there's Paul in Warrington again. He's giving us all... Michael, do you want to take that one?
Well, first of all, they're not precisely aligned, but they're aligned close enough to have made that, you know, noticeable. I think it was, wasn't it Robert Bouval who was the first one to notice that? Again, like I said, I'm a bit tired, you know, so I may get some of these references wrong here, but absolutely, of course, the geometry. I mean, earlier you had a chat, you had a question about the sacred geometry. Obviously, you see, as I said before, not only the modern elites are basing their civic structures on the celestial events, but the ancients, we know, obviously did it. So, you know, without getting into the whole ball of wax, the questioner is quite right. The pyramids were not just based on Orion. There's also connections to Alpha Draconis, you see, and don't forget all of the other different solstice and equinox points, the polar aspect, the polar alignments of the Earth, northwest, southeast axis, and all of this kind of thing. My work goes into how the pyramid and various other temple structures in Egypt are actually aligned to megalithic sites in other countries. So we also have to bear that in mind, that don't always look at the pyramid in an isolated way. Don't look at any ancient structure or monument in an isolated way. Start thinking in the geometry of this geosphere. Start thinking in terms of the sacred geometry, sacred geometrical links that actually link up one ancient site to another in a kind of this dot-to-dot, you know, way, right? A grid reaching all around the world. Now, of course, it's going to be compromised because a lot of these ancient sites have been destroyed by farmers and by other interested parties. We know what the Christians and the Islamic people did to the wonderful structures of Egypt. They decimated that country, its ancient ruins, its ancient temples. So, but don't forget that there was also this interrelation, incredible matrix of interrelated dimensions with the individual ancient sites. And this, of course, has been explored by people like Schwaller, Delubich, and a few others, you know. So, yeah, there's geometry of the individual sites and connection to the celestial dome, and then there's an interrelated connectivity between all of these different temple sites throughout the entire world.
Is it your belief that these temples were sited where they are not necessarily for ritual reasons, but to provide clues to future generations and to provide a guide? Do you think that's the case?
Yes, I do, and this also ties back into astrology, because I believe that the pyramid happened to have been constructed at exactly diametrically the opposite sign that we're in now. Jeff will corroborate the fact that if we're in the age of Pisces, then if you look across the zodiac, you see what, right? The age of Virgo. And it looks like that in my reading of the construction of the pyramid, not the Sphinx, let's leave that aside, I think it might have been an earlier structure. But the pyramid itself looks like it was created somewhere in the age of Leo or the age of Virgo, each age lasting approximately 2,000 years. And so the entire plan, the whole, and there was more pyramids, by the way, on the Giza plateau. So there is a certain specular dynamics going on even across time. The ancients didn't relate to time in the way that we do. So how come it is that the interest, it's like what Edgar Cayce also predicted, how come that the interest of modern people today in the latter part of the age of Pisces should be getting in like they are in a fever to understand ancient Egypt, Egyptology, happens to be diametrically opposed in the zodiac, like we're mirroring each other. It's like a call back through time. And I would actually go so far as to say that the ancients predicted this. The ancients, when they constructed these things, as your question implies, knew that their descendants would fall into a dark age, would fall into into war, would fall low spiritually, and then would start again to question. I do believe that they built some of their structures in a time portal kind of way, in which they understood that in another age, an age to come, we again, their descendants, would sort of climb out of the intellectual slime and would start to question again these great miracles that are right here in front of us on the earth. Yeah.
Do you think then that a purpose for the Pyramid of Giza will become evident at some time in the future? Because it doesn't really seem to have much purpose. I mean, there's not much of a burial site. I mean, I've been inside it, and it's just an upwards facing tunnel with a chamber at the top, which is very plain. I mean, it's not like, if you're going to go to all the trouble of building a pyramid to put your body in, you think you decorate it a bit or make it a bit special, and it's not very special, is it?
Until you understand what it was for. But even leaving that aside, absolutely, I think it is important, because you see, let's just say that because it is so, based on geometry, and it has these phi and pi ratios there, because it is a marker that shows you that the ancients were interested in astrology and they did map the heavens. That alone is interesting, you see, because then that alone could lead, as it has led, other people to look at an individual meaning for themselves, and more importantly, that the ancients had a tremendously different understanding of consciousness and also the world. So the pyramid stands there as a kind of an altar to meaning. It's not in itself going to issue a meaning. It's a way, a portal, it's almost like a mandala. In fact, very much it's like a mandala, because even mandalas use the 3-4 template in a one-dimensional way. If you look at a mandala, just like if you look at a Knights of Malta cross from above, you'll find that these mandalas all incorporate the 3-4 geometry.
I can see
so the pyramid, if anything, is a geometrical sort of mandala, a window into possibilities. It has its own meaning, but it also is a window into deeper mysteries that only a person who's committed to the esoteric tradition is going to really fully understand. In other words, the impure person, the person who's not able to get with that, is obviously not going to understand what it means or any other aspect connected to it. It will just be a mystery.
That'll be me then. I can see Jeff wants to pick up on this point.
Yeah, there is some evidence that the pyramids were for, at least one of their purposes was for initiation, and by that I mean having an out-of-body experience. There's been quite a few people who've actually had out-of-body experiences in the King's Chamber. Paul Bruton was quite a famous one who wrote a detailed account about it, which is pretty spectacular, what happened to him. And he was, when he came out of his body in there, he was met by Egyptian priests who took him through the wall into another space.
Wow.
But there's been other people. I mean, Napoleon's spent the night in there and came out ashen-faced and wouldn't discuss it with anybody. Mm-hmm. And the evidence really is from the Pyramid of Unas, which has got inscriptions, hieroglyphics inside, and they've decoded those, and it is about somebody who is using that while they're still alive. According to these inscriptions, it wasn't mainly to be used after death, but to be used while alive in order to facilitate an out-of-body trip, and then it describes going on this trip and then coming back to the body afterwards.
In this book, the 2012 in Your Pocket, you describe somebody else who has an out-of-body experience. Do you want to talk about that for a moment? With the magnets?
Ah, yes. Well, this is Walter Rawls. This is a guy who's very interested in the effects of magnetism, and he decided to do an experiment. He modified the frames of a pair of spectacles so that they would hold a bar magnet up against his forehead, the north pole of the magnet against the pineal gland.
Which is in the centre of your brain, isn't it?
Yes, the pineal gland's in the centre of the brain, and that is where the Indian caste mark is. It is basically
third eye.
Pinpointing where it projected onto the forehead. Okay. Yes, the third eye. He held this magnet, the north pole of the magnet was held against his forehead for between 10 and 30 minutes per day for a period of 3 weeks. During the first week, he saw a ghost appear out of one wall and went into the other wall, a semi-transparent human. And during the second week, he recognised the same ghost, this time a bit more solid-looking, come through one wall and go through the other. But just before it went through the other wall, it turned round and looked him in the eye, just before disappearing. And the third week, again he saw this ghost, and this time the whole walls of the room and everything evaporated, and he then saw it, the male ghost having or what he presumed was a ghost, having a conversation with a female in a garden, and after a few minutes, when he just stood there transfixed, the male turned round and stood back in amazement as he recognised Walter as the ghost that he'd seen the previous week. So somehow this magnet had transferred him, presumably, into another dimension where he was a ghost in that dimension.
I'm very interested in this dimension thing, and I know that Michael has written about these kind of things a lot. Michael, do you want to pick up on that point a bit about us having perceptions and maybe they're increasing or something? Is that something that's going to happen in 2012, do you think?
Yeah, it's happening already partly because of the movement of the planet Pluto, which archetypally represents the unconscious mind and the reality behind perceived reality. What Pluto does, or assists in doing, and of course we don't have time to get into the whole tangent of the inner zodiac concept, so I'll just use the traditional astrological jargon. And Pluto represents the reality behind perceived reality. What it also does, as I said, it's connected to Shiva's energy. It's a destructive, not destructive, but deconstructive force. And one of the things that gets deconstructed is people's ideas of reality. That leads us to the next point, which is if you can do that, if you can in fact transcend your ideas of reality, then yes, there's a chance, you see, that the purification process will increase, that the inner guides will assist in your process of personal evolution, and that will help open sensory inputs to the brain. I mean, these specialists have even said that there's 37 sensory inputs to the brain, not 5. So we've got something there that, we're not using, obviously, and some people that we might call clairvoyants or prophets are using. So there's no limit to the possibilities at all. And I believe that the deconstructive energy that's happening now, this sort of deconstructive season that we're going through, one of the positive aspects of that is that it is going to mean, a cleansing of the ways, and also the opening of the doors of perception for those who are ready to let go of the jive and let go of the lie, which is nothing but a burden that needs to be let go anyway.
We've got to go for a break now, and we'll get back to that point in a moment. So, once again, if you'd like to text in your questions or comments for Michael Tsarion or Jeff Stray, please do so now. Text the word EDGE, and then a space, and then your message to 87778, and we'll see you very soon. Welcome back to On the Edge with me, Theo Chalmers, and my special guests tonight, Jeff Stray and Michael Tsarion. Now, Michael, you were just talking about our inner guides, which is very fascinating to me. So if you can just expand on that a little bit, I'd be grateful.
Well, again, tying into these different countdown dates and also the move toward 2012 and the various changes that are taking place, this is basically, what is happening in a nutshell is that the individual, as they start to lose faith in these political tyrants and in the religious tyrannies and giving their power away and constantly submitting to external authorities, what's the flip side of that is that hopefully the inner voice of truth, which is latent within everybody, that scientists already know about, whether they admit it or not is another question. But these are the inner guides that are spoken of in the metaphysical tradition. There's a potential that these, people will start being moved from that, whether they call it the instincts or whether they call it the intuitions or, a still small voice, whether they perceive it as inside their heads or as some sort of outer voice guiding them. Again, these are all individual complexions to one concept. Of course, then we have another group of people who are going to be deeply threatened by the approach of that truth or that light, just in exactly the same way that people, balk and so cover their eyes when a physical light, a bright light, is put in them. So this is what we're dealing with now. We're in a part where the paths divide somewhat into the people who just can't get a handle on what's going on and want to stay with the old status quo, the old rotten status quo, and that's inevitable. And then we have other people, you see, who can get with this gig and who respond better to this. And even though they see these things that are happening that one group of people might think is very negative, very threatening, very, challenging, another group can see the same changes as needed, as adventurous. It's all about how you relate to it. It's all about, like I said, Joseph Campbell said, find your bliss, find the still point, attach to nothing, let go. It's okay to have a winter season, and both from the I Ching point of view, both from these different calendrical point of views, both from the astrological point of view. As a cycle or an aeon or an age comes to a close, that's what you have. You have a purgation cycle. In alchemy, it's known as putrefactio, mortificatio. It's the return to the earth. It's the a sort of like Odin hanging on the tree. It's a sort of a willful sacrifice of all that you are and all that you believe, so that something greater will emerge from that. That was the message of the pharaohs. That was the message, as one of your earlier questioners were talking about, that is in the Bible if you actually read it with intelligent eyes and not prejudicial, biased eyes. If you read all the scriptures, they're talking about this. Enoch, the very first words of Enoch is him being visited by his guides. One of the oldest books in the world. They may talk about those, or they may have translated those texts into saying angelos, or the messengers, or whatever term. But ultimately, you see, the prophet, the man of wisdom, is always protected. He's always under the wings of protection of his own guide. This is the Holy Spirit. This is the selfhood that is now, I believe, starting to awaken in the world. It's been threatening for a lot of people, but it's going to be very, very, good news for a lot of people who've been on this path for a long time.
Okay, I've got a question here from Ian in North Wales. He says, is this possibly why the Illuminati are so quickly trying to control the majority, maybe in fear of what it might mean for them?
Well, when you get into the question of what these guys fear and don't fear, that's a tremendously interesting subject. They do not fear a horde of misinformed, uneloquent individuals. So let's not think that a bunch of placard wavers with very, very thin grasp of who they are and what weapons they're using, they're not in fear of that at all. What they are in fear of is a small, intelligent group of people who are up to speed on, on who they are and the kind of devices and designs that they use. And so this then is the problem. So I would say that they they are armed up, to be making sure that these great teachers like the Ezra Pounds of the world are suppressed, that their work does not get out. I mean, that goes right across the board, even into technology with Raymond Royal Rife and Wilhelm Reich and Nikola Tesla and people like that. So, yeah, absolutely, there's a certain fear there. There is a certain fear there.
Jeff wants to come in here.
Yeah, I just wondered if Michael heard this story that there's one of the triads, the Chinese triads, that they've basically given a death threat to all the Illuminati. They've got a list of all their names. Have you heard anything like that?
Yeah, but I thought that it was just another bunch of disinformation. I find it highly unlikely, since I believe personally that every single one of the terrorist organizations and these secret bodies are controlled from a central source. I mean, that's not to say that they don't have dynastic rivalries, but I would take stuff like that with a pinch of salt. I don't think the triads would stand a chance if they came up against the Illuminati. That would be a lovely wrestling match to watch. It would go for about half a round, and then there'd be no more triads anymore.
All right, thanks.
Okay. Ian from North Wales again said, is this all just a blindfold created for us by the reptilians to give us hope before they wipe us out with an almighty cataclysm? Do you want to... No? That's a simple answer. Jeff, do you have anything on reptilians?
Not really, no. It's not something that I don't know anyone who's... I don't think I've met anyone who's seen the morphing thing, no. But no, no.
We're going to leave the reptilians out of this. Okay, let's talk a bit more about control then, and about how we can, how the people who do know what's going on can make a difference. Michael, do you want to pick up on that?
Absolutely. It carries on with what we were saying about the uneducated mass screaming for reform. In the pigsty that's already been created by the masters. That obviously we should be waking up to realize that isn't going to get very far. And then we have this educated mass who takes the real power into their own hands, because you see, the architects of control have control. They don't actually have power. We, the people, have the power. We just don't realize we have it.
So there is hope
so
then,
it's a system. It's a situation in which we have to understand that the power lies with us, the control lies with them. That's a key part of this. And what was your question again there, Theo?
Well, what can the people who do know what's going on, who are aware of what's going on, how can they make a difference? How can they make a change?
Oh yeah, by continuing to expose, by the way, the internet and books and TV shows and whatnot, and radio shows like your own, make sure that you never lose track of the newcomers coming into this subject matter, who are hungry for this kind of information, and continue the work of exposure. Don't stop. Don't get arrested. I see a lot of what happens with people who get on this path is that they think they found their little niche, and then their development gets arrested, and then they say, I know it all now. Now I'm an expert. Now I go with this. This is not good. One has to look at this as a great adventure and continue studying, and get your arms around all of this information, make use of the different materials that are out there, and continue the work of exposure. This what it is, and it's a certain kind of study. Remember, it's esoteric, so academics who maybe don't understand what this is all about, you have to adjust your settings. It's not something that is going to be applicable when you first look at it. That's why we get a lot of criticalness from people. But they have to adjust their settings and realize we're talking in an alternative worldview here. We're looking at history, and we're looking at man's behavior in a little bit of an alternative way. And there's really nothing wrong with that. It's actually very healthy, you see, to push the limits of the known and to push the limits of our perspectives. It's actually very fascinating, ultimately,
So there is hope, isn't there?
There's always hope. Again, if people can let go of some of these crazy ideas of reality that they have, realize that they do have the power, do start studying up, on your enemy. You see, it's just like a diagnostic. You have to diagnose where the infection is coming from before you have a hope of healing it. And so we're in an age now in which we have more gifts to actually, you know, study, more books, more exposure of this thing. We're in the best possible time to have that kind of a proactive response, not reaction. See, in the past, our forefathers didn't have the information at their hands. They didn't have the technologies. They could only react. They could not respond proactively, you see. Today, we have a totally different understanding of this dynamic. And perhaps even in the past, the way we would have maybe gone about combating these individuals would have been also, you know, futile. Right now, we have a different way of doing it by exposure. It's like I say in my work, is like these people claim to love light. That's why they even use terms like Luciferian and Illuminati. Well, how would they feel if we turned that light that they claim that they love on them? This is basically what is happening now. It's a tug of war, and we're taking the light away from them, the Olympian torches, you know, and turning it around, saying, let me diagnose you for a minute. How do you like it when the camera is turned on you, you know? And that's what we need to be doing. It doesn't need to be violent. It doesn't need to be a crazy, you know, reaction. It needs to be an intelligent response to something that is pestilential in our midst. That is already happening.
So Jeff, you've mentioned in your book titled "Catastrophe or Ecstasy," you know, the beyond 2012. I mean, is there hope in the message of 2012 and all these cultures? Is there some built-in hope? It's not going to be the end of the world, and that's it, is it?
No. Whatever's happening here happens cyclically, although it seems that it goes up a level each time. But and of course, when it happened before, we didn't have the technology that will be affected by. I see the weather changes that we're having now as a side effect of the main event, and the main event being, from what I've discovered, is a consciousness event. In fact, you could say, like the Hopi, that it is a kind of a birth event. In fact, Terence McKenna said once, he said, if an alien was to come around the corner and see a woman giving birth, he'd think that she was in the throes of an agonizing death, metastasizing a huge tumor. But in fact, the opposite would be the case, because it's a birth event, and those are just the side effects of the main event. And that seems to be, you know, the message that I'm getting.
So things like the strandings of whales and dolphins and you know, tsunamis and earthquakes and hurricanes and tornadoes.
Yeah.
These are a kind of sideshow for the main event.
I think so. And of course, as you know, these are not, controversially, not just happening on Earth, these weather events. They're happening throughout the whole solar system.
Talk about that a bit, because that puts those global warming people in their place, doesn't it? If Mars is heating up, and Venus and Jupiter and so on.
Well, yes. I mean, I've looked at earthquake databases and checked on other people's information. They say that it's ramping up slowly. I've checked that information, and it does hold together that the earthquakes are increasing over the years.
But this isn't HAARP, is it?
Pardon?
HAARP. You know, the American...
No.
Auroral... whatever it is.
No, if you just take a certain... only a certain size of earthquake and above, and graph that from the database. There's two separate databases that produce virtually the same information now. But it's throughout... They found on all the planets in the solar system, they are going through atmospheric and magnetic changes as well as the Earth, because they also say that the Earth is, in fact, in the beginnings of a magnetic reversal at the moment. The poles are accelerating towards reversal, and the general background field is lowering, and there's outbreaks of reverse field. All these three things have been modelled in the laboratory as being parts of magnetic reversal.
So we've heard that before, haven't we? It's in the record, in the geologic record, that the North Pole was the South Pole, and vice versa several times in the past.
Yeah, and if you average that out, we're well past you know, due for that to happen again.
But what does that mean? I mean, I don't know where the North Pole is sitting here. I mean, I don't go, oh, I can feel it from that direction. I mean, does it make a big difference? Do birds stop migrating? I mean...
Well, probably about 2,000 years ago, before we had all the interfering fields of electronic devices and when the actual Earth's magnetic field was stronger, then people would have had probably some sense of where north is, like some animals do.
Well, we do have a magnetite in some parts of our brain, don't we?
We do have magnetite in the bones of our sinuses and in the actual pineal gland, and this is what really interests me in the connect-up here of the possibility of a magnetic reversal, is that the pineal gland is having this magnetite in it. It could be that under a reversal or acceleration of the field, that will cause that movement of magnetite in the pineal will cause it to secrete hallucinogenic molecules.
This is like the chap you talked about earlier who had the magnet on his head.
Yeah, because...
I think you need to talk about that a bit, don't you?
Oh, yeah, I should have added to that. If you want to make that experiment, folks, do make sure that you get the North Pole and not the South Pole, because if you get them confused, you can end up with a brain tumour.
So let's get this absolutely straight, and we're not giving any advice or suggestions
to
anybody, but this person that you talked about put the North Pole next to his head.
Right, yes.
Not the South Pole.
And with a bar magnet, it can be confusing because they're not always labelled clearly.
So there you go. If you want to do it, you do it at your own risk. Okay.
But the fact is that the pineal gland, it's now known, has at least 3 hallucinogenic molecules that it can secrete into the bloodstream, and there's a possibility that could happen as a result of this magnetic effect.
Okay. Here's a question. What are your thoughts on the seed bank being built in Svalbard, Norway, funded by Bill Gates, etc., and due for completion in August 2012, and that's from Lou in Coventry. What do you think of that, Jeff?
Sounds like a good idea.
Good idea? Good idea, Michael?
Not really.
Okay.
The Doomsday Vault concept worries me a lot, because food, of course, is the ultimate control weapon of the elite. So, the whole Monsanto, GMO concept tying into these doomsday vaults, I talked about this extensively on Alex Jones's show when I was on with him. Very, very sinister as far as I'm concerned. The DVD series we're doing is about artificiality, both in consciousness and also in the world. And man's penchant, you see, for messing with nature and making everything artificial. So is there something about our cities, our societies, that are becoming more and more artificial, like some sort of, Quatermass type experiment in which, in the end, we'll be living in completely enclosed, sanitized, air-conditioned, super fluorescent lit, cities in which even the food is under control? Is this where we're heading? We've got some alarming stuff, because remember, as I said earlier on, not everyone in society, it's ludicrous to imagine that everyone in society is going to get with the new kind of, spirit that is awakening. And we're going to have people who want to remain just as toxic, and then we'll have a situation in which these people who are not looking at their emotions, they're not okay with who they are not seeking for any kind of deeper meaning in life or anything like that. They're absolutely, infatuated with the narcissistic expressions and modalities of life. What about those people? Where are they going to go? What are they going to be doing? Are these the people who are going to be running headlong to the pharmaceutical industries, saying, help me, give me the happy drug? Are these the individuals who will be more threatened by nature, because they're already threatened unconscious, they're already threatened by their own emotions, they're already as the great scholar Wilhelm Reich elaborated upon, you see, the disassociated human being, the mutilated human being, the pathological creature is estranged within his own psyche, within his own body, how do you think he's going to relate to other people and to the world or to the God force, you see? So we're going to have there's also a danger, you see, that and then in comes Big Brother to co-opt a lot of this by even projecting gods onto the night sky, to give the illusion that the gods are visiting, or that there's some sort of Armageddon. You mentioned HARP earlier on. They've got that kind of weaponry to incite and to create weather distortions and changes and earthquakes and so forth and so on. So we also never have to rule out the other side and what they will do, because these people do not just roll over and go to sleep when they know there's an age of awakening coming. We've already established that these people are themselves sorcerers. They're magi in their own right. They have incredible amount of people who know what's going on. So they don't just sit there and let it happen. They have a retaliatory measure, as they've done all the way down through the centuries. They're already working on the colonialization of the human consciousness. My goodness. So these people, we have to also be up to speed on what they may be doing to combat and to react against the awakening that is also taking place. You know, we definitely go into this in the DVD, and it's something that preoccupies a lot of my work, is what is coming. And the control of foodstuffs, the control of water, not just the control of oil, a new kind of territorialism, which we've been seeing since the Bush administrations, both of them. And not that anything is going to get better with the present guy, you know, it'll just be like what I've described as a scenic route to hell, as opposed to a blood-soaked road to hell, a road to destruction, a road to the global village. So we have to keep up to speed on their particular retaliatory measures.
Michael, I'm going to have to go to another break now. Once again, if you'd like to text in your questions or comments for Michael Tsarion or Jeff Stray, do so now. Text the word EDGE, then a space, then your message to 87778. See you very soon. Welcome back to On the Edge with me, Theo Chalmers, and my special guest, Jeff Stray, in the studio here, and Michael Tsarion on the line from somewhere in Europe. It's been a fascinating show so far. This is the final segment, so we're going now for the kind of a look at what it all means, what are the implications, and so on. The point you made during the break there, Jeff, about these 9 gods. Do you want to pick up on that again?
Yes, because being as how this is really the only solid prophecy we've got that's actually engraved from the classic era, and it's also supported by prophecies in the Chilambalams as well, that also predict the return.
You better explain the Chilambalams.
The Chilambalams, this is the Jaguar priest prophecies. It was written down after the conquest, but from material that existed beforehand.
Okay.
In there are prophecies that also speak of the return of the 9. And there was actually a reason for interpreting that as about the 13 Bacton cycle rather than as about the 13 Ketun cycle, which is the later calendar that was being used at the time it was written down. So without going into the detail, it's quite a convincing reason that the prophecies were retained from earlier times and reapplied to the shorter calendar. So in other words, they are about 2012 and the return of these 9. So what I found recently looking into who these 9 gods are is that cultures throughout the whole world have a concept of 9 gods. I mean, you've got the Ennead from Egypt, and you've got the 9 in the Norse system. You've got 9 realms, each having its own god in charge. And very often there is an association with the underworld. And in the Grail mythology, centred around, one of the myths centred around Glastonbury.
Well, the Knights of the Round Table.
Yeah, it's the commentators say that the Isle of Avalon represents the underworld, and that Arthur had to go into the underworld to have his wound healed, and there's the 9 goddesses there. These islands of 9 goddesses are always associated with the underworld, and the hero's journey into the underworld to heal himself and come back out again. And sometimes it involves getting something out of the cauldron while he's in there.
But is this symbolism, or is this... I mean, are you saying that there may well be 9 gods?
Well, it depends how you look at it. I personally see it as levels of the psyche, if you like, that we have to... I mean, it corresponds very much with what Michael was saying about guides, inner guides, that we have to heal our own shadow. We have got to go into ourselves and dig up all that stuff and confront it, this stuff that is our shadow material.
It's one of the things we discussed in the break briefly was about the truth and how do you know the truth. I mean, Michael, would you like to pick up on that? How do you know that there is so much stuff out there telling us so many contradictory things? How do we know when we get the truth?
It's a process, and it also involves thinking. Thought is what divides us from every other, aspect of the creation. And the highest aspects of thinking is the human reason. And so we don't need our reason lessened, we need it sharpened. Of course, the great journey of life, the great journey of discovery, it has its challenges. But those challenges are made less when you approach it with the right tools. And the right tool is the human reason, united with the passion. I mean, how did Vermeer paint his canvases? How did Rembrandt do his self-portraits? How did the Sistine Chapel get done? It's a combination of man's passion, his dedication. See, remember, the word philosophy, Theo, is not just the gaining of knowledge, it actually means the love of knowledge, and that's completely 2 different things there. What we have on the side of the hidden elites are people who are using knowledge to manipulate and to dumb down and to control. But knowledge can be used for other purposes, as we've been discussing. And when it comes to the 9, yeah, we find the 9 in the Ennead of Egypt. We find it in the Kabbalistic tradition. One only has to look at the number 9 itself. If you draw the number 9 on a piece of paper, it is actually a 1 attempting to return to a circle. And don't forget that in German, 9, to say 9, means no, nothing, 0, right? So it's a return. It's a Euroboric return, because that's exactly what happens. It's exactly the same thing that Jeff said about the metaphor of the woman giving birth. It's your perspective of how you see it. You can't change the realities of good and evil. They're going to be with mankind forever. What you have charge over, though, is your attitude towards those realities. And that, again, comes from you're either moving from an emotional, limbic point of view, or you're moving from a rational center when you look at these kinds of things. The reason why the 9 gods, how I interpret it, connecting to what we've been talking about with astrology, is that before there was 12 signs, certain cultures had 9 signs. And even within a culture, say you just take the Maya, or say you just take the Druids, like I said, the Egyptians had a 36-house zodiac. So even within the same priesthood, what we have to understand is they didn't use just one universal zodiac. Some zodiacs were broken down, some were expanded, and there was a time, when the zodiac, what we know to be the zodiac, was 9. And just like I've said, even if you have a 12-house zodiac or a 13-house zodiac, what are the houses of the zodiac but mirrors of a single person? They're faces or visages. They're aspects of a single individual. Like Arthur's Round Table was a manifestation of one psyche. Jesus with his 12 disciples, or Odin with his 12 helpers, is a manifestation of one being, the hero with 1,000 faces. Hercules and his 12 trials, the Kabbalistic model, the zodiacal model, is nothing but the individual, be he the fool, or the hermit, or the hanged man, or the enlightened one, whatever. This is a single individual. But these are metaphors, because whatever happens in the individual, the myth's always used an individual, like the hero with 1,000 faces, confronting his shadow, overcoming great challenges. But don't forget that what goes for the individual actually is the same thing with societies. Societies also go through these cycles of the winter cycle and the spring cycle and the summer cycle. Civilizations go through it. This is the key thing that I think underlines everything we've been talking about. That these metaphors are in mythology that were written down in ancient times are the story of the consciousness of men, which exists within the individual on a private level, but is also articulated to the, and it's also, by the way, articulated to the planet. I love that anecdote earlier where you were talking about the natural disasters and the fauna, the death of the fauna. You see the whales and the porpoises and all of this kind of thing. All of this is connected because, as Wilhelm Reich showed, you know, there is a connection between what goes on in your head, what goes on in your thinking, and what goes on in the world, even affecting climate and even affecting the geosphere. And these teachings, these mysteries, you see, are still only, again, we're starting to get back in touch with what these really mean. Jeff was talking about the transformative experiences people have near the pyramid, which is nothing, as I said, except a mandala in limestone or in granite. You know, these external temples, wherever they are, sacred, holy places, are merely replicas, simulacras of what man is going through within his own temple, you see. So the idea is to put the focus again back on consciousness. You have the Chilambalam, where the priests are dressed in the jaguar. You know, they use the jaguar symbolism. Doesn't that connect with the priests of Egypt who wore the panther skins? Doesn't that connect with how Jesus was called Joshua ben Pantera? And you'll always see the pharaohs and the high priests dressed, again, very similarly in a jaguar pelt or a panther pelt. You see, the cult of the priest, the cult of the one who understood that it's about personal purification. That individual is then qualified, sanitized enough, sane enough to work with the energies of the earth, to work with the energies of nature, and hopefully then to go on and lead his fellow man to a greater sense of stability and selfhood. But the leaders we've got right now are misleaders. They're the most toxic of the bunch. And we have to be very aware, as I said before the break, about what their strategies are to keep man in that servitude. Or maybe they want to replace the chains of, if you're coming from the Bertrand Russell school, yeah, maybe they want to take away the chains of iron and replace them with chains of gold. Throw us a few more pillows in our cell. And most people, as you can see around in the world, are quite happy to accept that. But I'm not happy to accept that. You know, imprisonment of any kind, psychic or other, is not right. And just because they've given us chains of gold and a servitude, you know, with a smile, they're making us smiling depressives, a tyranny without tears, you know, it does not satisfy me. And so my work, you know, is very much to make people not happy with injustice and not happy with the things that are going on, and to make them realize that they have the power to affect incredible change, not through reaction, but through response, healthy, powerful, empowered response.
Well, Shakespeare wrote that there's a tide in the affairs of man which you've taken up the flood, etc. And from what you're saying, there is kind of an unstoppable tide, isn't there? And it's a question really of whether you're sitting in the boat when it comes, because people like you and Jeff have brought consciousness to those people, or you're not, or you're going to drown. I mean, do you think that's largely it? It's unstoppable. Whatever change is happening is unstoppable. It's just a question of being aware enough that you can be sitting in the boat. Do you think that's right?
But once a person is, first of all, introduced to their own sacredness, which I believe it was what yoga, magic, mysticism, you see, metaphysics was really meant to do. It was to start a person off understanding their own empowerment, that they are their own priest, they are their own priestess, they do not need external authorities except as signposts. They certainly don't need the type of tyrannical stuff that's been going on for the last 2,000 years or more. Once a person is empowered that way, be they a child, you see, once this debris of disempowerment is removed, then the thing becomes an adventure. And then you leave it up to the individual's choice, whether they want to go with the river, wherever the river happens to take them, or they want to row. You know, they want to sort of have a sense of direction with where they're going. But that's an individual choice in the matter. Ultimately, you see, even to remain ignorant is a choice of individuals. We're not trying to interfere there. We're not trying to say that a person can't make those choices. but we're trying to show them the world as clearly as we can so that they can make those choices. But if people want to choose to remain, you know, fixated and in a toxic state, they don't want to discover, you know, what the mysteries are, that's absolutely their own choice, and you know, you can't interfere with that level of choice, unfortunately. All you can do is work on yourself and then see what happens later on with, you know, if you're guided to do something different.
Well, I've got a question here, and it says, I don't know who it's from, it doesn't say the name. It says, where and what will you be doing at the winter solstice 2012? I think I'll ask you both that. Let's start with you, Michael.
Oh, that's impossible to say. First of all, I'm a person who can't even think 5 minutes ahead.
Okay, let's
it's a strange contradiction in my nature to be into prophecy, and yet in my own life I don't even make plans. So, you know, I'm so sort of focused on where I'm at right now. Probably doing exactly the same kind of thing I'm doing right now, hopefully. You know, as I said, as Jeff said also, it's not the end of the world. You know, it's ridiculous to think that we can affect nature to that extent, or the planet. What it is going to be is a phase shift from one level of mentality, from one sort of paradigm to another, but more drastic than we've ever known before. But these paradigm shifts are historically known. They do happen. The one that's happening now, it's already taking place and will happen then, is a gigantic shift in the consciousness of human beings that people need to be prepared and ready for. That's all.
So, Jeff, where will you be?
I'm planning to be in Peru, actually. There's an interesting prophecy that comes from Peru called the Pachacuti prophecy, which means it literally means the world turning over, but it also means time turning over.
Turning over like in the North South.
Well, that's what
becoming the
some
South
people
Pole.
think, that when they hear that, they imagine the whole Earth turning upside down, but in fact, their word Pachamama means Mother Earth, so it's like the Hopi say it's transition of the world. They got a word with a double meaning, so it's a world era. So it's a turning over of the era. But basically, it transpires that on the 1st of August 2012 is when the Peruvians are expecting this advent of what they call Terepe Pacha, the age of meeting ourselves again.
Oh, that sounds interesting.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'd like to, really. But...
Well, what they describe that as, they have, in the shamanic cosmos, you've got an overworld and underworld and the everyday world in the centre, and the shamans will travel up and down the world tree and visit the other worlds and bring back information. They say that the overworld and the underworld are going to converge on the everyday world, so our perceptions will broaden their horizons beyond the normal boundaries. So there's another prophecy that goes with that, that every year they have this festival up on a mountain called the Snow Star Festival, Mount Alzangate it's called.
Where's that near? The people who might want to be there on 2012.
Well, it's somewhere in the Andes. I'm going to find out exactly where. But the saying goes that out of this festival, around that time, will come the first 5th level priest. I mean, up till now, there's only been 4 levels of initiation among the Quero Indians. And the first priest will then go to a little town called Urcos and meet the 2nd priest, and then they'll go on a pre-designated route, picking up 5 male and 5 female priests and priestesses, who will then meet at the temple of Rakshi and have a ceremony, and out of that ceremony will come the first 2 6th level priests, and they will be the first humans of the next evolutionary level who have a visible shining aura. So I'd just love to witness that.
Oh, I bet you would. Actually, I'm just going to tell everybody, if you want to buy one of Jeff's books, they're all available, or at least some of them are available, on the edgemediatv.com website. And Michael Tsarion's latest DVD, Architects of Control, Mass Control and the Future of Mankind, is available from the website architectsofcontrol.com, and I think there are probably links there to other websites for Michael as well. So we've got 9 minutes and 20 seconds left of the programme. What I want, I guess, to do now is to ask you both, what's the upside and what's the downside of where we are now? Let's start with you, Jeff. What's the upside and what's the downside? Have I put you on the spot?
Oh, yes. Well, I don't know, could you rephrase it?
All right, well, it's clear there's some hope,
Yeah.
but there's also threats. How do they balance each other out, do you think?
Well, yeah, I've looked at this from an overview. I haven't got, like most people, have got a particular angle on this, and I'm quite fluid in the information I'm taking on board. That I don't have to edit anything to make it fit into any particular angle. So I don't think we can actually say clearly exactly what is going to happen because there's not enough information. The information is still coming in.
Well, we've still got a few years, haven't we, before 2012? Not
Yeah.
many, but, you know, it's getting close.
Part of my job, as I've seen it, is to save people a lot of time in barking up the wrong tree and going down dead ends and sort out where people have done a lot of research but based it on poor information. So that saves people a lot of time. So it's really a group effort for everybody to try and find out what's going on. And there are a hell of a lot of 2012 books coming out now at the rate of about 8 a month, I think, at the moment.
But very few have done 25 years of research.
No, that's true. A lot of them
pulled together the stuff that you've pulled together. It is quite extraordinary body of work.
A lot of them are fictional or don't say a lot that's new, actually. Yeah, there's one or two good ones in the pipeline. But
okay.
yes, I think there's a lot of room for optimism. That's what it is overall. Well, if you look at this overall, most of the catastrophe theories that are going around are actually based on bad information. So
those people who were saying that 96% of the Earth's population will be wiped out.
Yes, there's not
largely by design of those in power.
The trouble is, people are always trying to read their Sunday school teachings on the Book of Revelation into this, and so they automatically assume when you mention anything like this that you're talking about total wipeout, end of the world, and they just don't hear what you have to say. This is, you know, it's got a lot of an evolutionary potential, and that is, you know, really the main event.
Okay, Michael, upside, downside. Got 5 minutes.
Well, that's a great way to put it, because I love what Jeff was saying there about the idea of reversal. You know, all my life since I was very young, I was studying the work of William Blake, another poet, of course. And, you know, he spoke a lot about reversal because in his iconography of the creation, he always spoke about the supreme God, which was Albion, by the way, which is, of course, doubled up as a name for what? A name for Britain, right?
Yeah.
And he said that in the beginning of creation, and people will be familiar with even some of the man's drawings, he said that when Albion fell from the heavenly, you know, enlightened state, he fell head first into the creation. And his body then split into 4 different hemispheres. And this is how the material creation, you know, came about, and that's why we have 4 hemispheres of consciousness. We have the 4 directions. But the idea being that just like the hanged man, he fell head first. And this was then the fall of God, or the fall of consciousness, you know, and then subsequently we've got to sort of find the pieces and put it all together again, which is this process that we're doing. The zodiac is a manifestation of that, because it's really the 3 and the 4 that makes the 7 and the 12. That's how you get the zodiac. The zodiac is actually based on the foundation of 3 and 4, which is interesting, isn't it? Because it turns up in the pyramid. That's what that is. So again, we have some interesting numerology there. But the idea is that when Albion would find himself again, of course he has to split. It's just like splitting the apple. The seeds have to come out. Now you can't stick the apple back on the tree once you've plucked it. You're now honor bound to cut it, plant the seed, and the cycle of creation begins. But Blake then fast forwards and says, okay, if Albion ever should reconstitute himself, if he should find his feminine half, if he should reconcile with his shadow, you see, his iconography is very elaborate and very amazing. Then he said, of course, that, you know, Albion will be restored, but that is again another inversion, right, in which now he'll be head first again. So in the Blake's iconography, north was always south and south north, tying into this whole thing of the inverted tree of life and whatnot. And so that's what is happening right now. People might, and in the prophecies that Jeff was stating there, any prophecy that talks about a reversal of the world is absolutely not, in my reading of things, not a metaphor of something physical that's going to happen. That's why I agree with Jeff about watching for that. I don't believe these prophecies are based on any factuality. Not that we can rule it out. Of course, we can't rule it out. But in my mind, this stuff is of an esoteric, metaphorical nature, and it's really talking about reversals of the consciousness of the psyche of man. People, if they meditate on the story of Odin, of the story of Buddha under the tree, of Christ under the tree, of Quetzalcoatl, you see, he also was shown in proximity to the tree of life. If they look into the iconographies of William Blake, if they start looking at this thing metaphorically, they'll understand about the fall of light, whether you're looking at it Kabbalistically from a higher place down through 9 or 10 spheres of intelligence. So the reversal, the awakening, is in itself a form of reversal. You know, Plato spoke about this when Socrates said there's two kinds of blindness. There's the blindness of those who emerge from the cave, right, the dark place of shadow, into the light. They're momentarily blinded to the light. These are the enlightened ones. And there's the other blindness of the enlightened one, like a Socrates, who comes from the light into the darkness to save the souls of others. He is also himself blinded. The blindness is a twofold kind of blindness. And there's an incredible dynamic, incredible story in that, you see, about the kind of reversal and twisting and this idea of the yin and the yang, the nagual and the tonal. And so what we're going to be experiencing now is in fact a pole shift. But it's not going to be a pole shift in the world. That's how the ego, that doesn't want to integrate these psychic understandings, this archetypal aspect, this is how it understands it on the stereotypical level. It reads it literally, in exactly the way that many scriptures are taken literally, or the way that certain words are taken literally. But this is actually a metaphor for a reversal of consciousness. There's nothing wrong with it. I'm all for it. But the idea is that we need to start reading this stuff on a more of an esoteric level to realize that there is indeed a pole shift. There is a reversal taking place. But it's the reversal of our thinking, of our consciousness. Hopefully that will mean that right brain, left brain dynamic changes. Or if you want to, use the vernacular of consciousness, unconsciousness, or the lower chakras merging with the higher chakras. The rhetoric changes depending on what kind of tradition you're coming from. But again, people need to be okay with that sea change, okay with that reversal, because there's nothing wrong in it. It might in fact be that man is already standing on his head, spiritually speaking. Maybe this is his chance to stand on his feet for a change. Nothing wrong with that.
I'll bring to that. Okay. Carry on, Michael.
So again, I would emphasize that people need to look into this whole concept of the inner zodiac. Emphasized, this idea. Look into the idea of not being afraid of people, of our own emotions. You remember in the Star Trek concept, they have the Vulcans. And it's a cliche, isn't it? Everyone knows that the whole idea of the creation of Vulcan and the creation of the Vulcans is that they decided to turn off emotion because emotion had been causing them so much conflict, and then to become technological creatures, individuals who are very up on technology and also disciples of logic, right? Okay. I would rephrase that. What they're really saying is, in the metaphor, is that it's the troublesome or toxic emotions, because of course you wouldn't want to get rid of something that's not causing you any trouble. The emphasis there that a lot of people are not haven't thought about is that, to take the metaphor, the Vulcan society, the super technological, super Apollonian, super technocracy, went towards logic and went towards technology because they were troubled. They had a problem with their emotions, the troublesome emotions, what we would call in psychological parlance the darker side of the psyche. We are in that countdown today where we might end up with that kind of a technocracy because that's what people are doing today.
Michael?
One leads to the other.
Talking of countdown, I'm afraid we've run out of time. That's all we've got time for tonight. Thank you to everyone for watching our special 2-hour show, and to those who texted, and thanks to my very special guests, Michael Tsarion and Jeff Stray. If you've enjoyed this show, please tell all your friends. Next week, we'll be back with another exciting show that might even change your life. Until then, remember, they're watching you, watching us, watching them. Cheerio.